Well, welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to talk a little bit about common mental health experiences that church leaders might encounter in their day-to-day journey of leadership. And so I want to start first with the idea of stress. It's something that church leaders bring up a lot that they are experiencing. It's part of leadership, I think. But what is stress in practical terms?
Yeah, so I think when I first think of stress now as a therapist, I think of it as it's actually protective. It's actually meant to help us and guide us. But I think often stress, we think of it in negative terms, of course. It tends to feel, because when we're feeling it, it doesn't feel good. It feels overwhelming. We don't know what to do with it. But I think generally speaking, like stress is our body's natural response to like a challenge or a demand. And it can be in the short term or the long term. So there's like obviously lots of short-term stressors we can think of, like public speaking would be one for a lot of people. There'd be even some, traumatic events or different types of things that people experience, or conflict with others. Like those are some key, probably stressors people experience. But I think often we also think of kind of the cumulative effect of stress over time, and just how the toll that takes on us. So I think of stress as like a bell curve. If we lived with no stress, I don't think many people have that experience very often, especially once we're adults. But having no stress we wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't get up and get out of bed. We'd have no incentive to kind of function on any level or engage with the world meaningfully. So that's kind of one end of that curve, which isn't always relevant. The other end of that bell curve, though, is like high stress all the time. It's like not tuning into those emotions that are going on that are leading to that. And so I think that's when we start to get to, it almost feels like we're short-circuiting, or we're like getting paralyzed because we're so flooded with all those emotions. So that tends to be when we're not functioning as well. So both ends of the bell curve can kind of look similar, but it's this sense of shutting down or not functioning optimally.
Right.
The middle of that curve is kind of what we think of as the sweet spot of stress. So it's kind of like functioning well. We're aware that we're feeling some pressure. There's a motivation to do things, to get up and function and engage with the world. But we're also able to kind of recognize when we need to pull back, when we need to rest, when we need to take breaks, so that we can kind of recharge and keep going. And it's kind of, the hope is that, you find like a sustainable way to manage that stress.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of framing it too, the idea that like stress in balance is helpful.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of kind of keeping it in a place where it's balanced enough.
Yeah, and not reframing it from just like a negative experience to like it actually is helpful, but identifying that there's thresholds where we get to and we need to maybe tune in differently.
Definitely, yeah. And what's the difference between stress and anxiety? Like anxiety is something we talk about a lot, and it can feel similar maybe? Yeah,
it definitely can. I think with anxiety, it tends to be, obviously it's identify like worry or nervousness with anxiety. I think it tends to be just the way we feel toward uncertainty in our life, like things that we just don't have control over. And so, when we just, as human beings, we don't like to be in limbo. We don't like to not know how something's going to turn out. So there's this like anticipatory kind of aspect of anxiety where it's like, what's going to happen? Tied to like future events often. And so, I think that to me is anxiety. It's a bit different than stress, but I think we feel it in very similar ways.
Interesting, yeah. And another thing that we talk about a lot in common mental health experiences is depression. I think it's a word we're very used to hearing, but what does depression really mean?
Yeah, again, depression no surprise to anybody kind of experienced it, but it's like low mood. It's tends to be like a mood type of disorder is how we would clinically talk about depression, but there's a lot of people that experience low mood that aren't clinically depressed. It's kind of when we start to feel feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, that would be some signs of depression, often tied to maybe a decrease of motivation in things that we've typically found that we would enjoy beforehand. So just more, we might call it dysthymia, but just not being as engaged with the world in the same way. Leads to isolating ourselves, not always wanting to be in contact with people as much because of just like an overall sadness that we might be feeling and not sure what to do with that or how other people will accept us. And it's often tied to a lot of physical symptoms too. So things like sleep, it can be sleeping too much, not sleeping enough. It can be tied to appetite, again, eating a lot more than usual or eating less than usual. Like large swings in, weight over a short period of time can be a sign of like intense depression that's settled in. And I guess cognitive changes as well, like whether it's concentration, just having brain fog, some of that stuff too can be tied to depression. So, and it can be rooted in lots of different things. Yeah.
And is it something that often comes on very quickly for people, or is it something that can kind of sneak up on someone over time?
I think for some people, they live with depression probably for most of their lives and kind of just get used to it. Some people might know that, and some people might not even know that. They might just adapt and kind of truck along. But yeah, there's other people where it just, it hits them. It's suddenly something shifts and suddenly they're just not able to function in the same way, or they might be experiencing suicidal thoughts or feelings that's really, really, really alarming if you haven't experienced that before, and suddenly that comes out of seemingly nowhere. So yeah, the onset of that can be in different ways.
Yeah. And a lot of the things you described with stress and anxiety and depression feel like things that we might encounter when we experience burnout.
Yeah.
And that's something that church leaders, I think, many of them encounter at some point in their leadership journey, if not several times.
Yeah.
What is burnout, and how is it different than some of those other things you discussed?
Yeah, I think of burnout as more that top end of that bell curve I was talking, the stress curve that I was talking about earlier. So when we get to that point where it's kind of, if we haven't been tuning into those emotions over time, I think emotions that are not tuned into lead to, challenges, whether that's panic attacks, whether that is something like burnout, which they're not always synonymous with each other, but you can have, panic attacks and those kinds of things happening as we're kind of shutting down or getting to that point where we're hitting our limit. I think, I often think of analogies when it comes to burnout. Like I love when I've done workshops with different groups, I'll ask people, give me some examples of what burnout feels like for you. And like, you'll hear things like, it feels like I'm a teapot that's boiling, but I've run out of water, and yet there's still heat. Or I'm like a frog that's in the pot, and then the pot's slowly boiling, and I'm just becoming aware of that this is too hot. It's actually starting to burn me. The other one that's really like pretty palpable is like somebody said to me once, it feels like I'm in a bathtub and the water's slowly draining around me, and I'm starting to feel like my body weight in a different way, which I don't know if you felt that before, but it's like,
a really interesting
it's pretty powerful, like when I heard that. So
yeah,
there's lots of different ways. I think there's some misconceptions around what burnout actually is. It's not like it's hard to just identify, but I think it's really when we're just not able to, we don't care as much. We've lost the empathy that we had for the work that we're doing, whatever that is. For caregivers, it can hit hard, but it can hit anybody, no matter what kind of job you're doing. And you just don't have the resources or the reserves. You don't have those same reserves to draw from that you used to have. You used to be able to kind of truck along, and you could perform and keep moving. And I think with burnout, it comes to people just say like, it feels like I'm running on fumes. I just don't have the same, which then can lead to things like anxiety. It can lead to things like depression, because it is like jarring to experience yourself differently than how you've experienced yourself all along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really interesting point to the idea of kind of running out of empathy as a function of burnout.
Yeah.
For leaders who are in jobs where they're in an environment that kind of depends on them being very empathetic, people like pastors who are in very caring roles where people are coming to them with really personal problems or challenges, and they're kind of expected to be able to give from a place of empathy.
Yeah.
What happens when you don't have that inside of you anymore?
Yeah.
But you're still in that environment where you kind of are expected to be able to give from that place.
Yeah, I mean, you said expected. I think expectations are huge. I think I think it's good to be aware, and we'll probably get to this at another point as well, but being aware of the expectations we're living by and the expectations that those around us have for us is really important. And I think sometimes that saying of like something's got to give, I think sometimes we really do actually need to figure out what that is. Is there anything that we're holding on to that we might be able to set down? Because, and people say, like, I can't, like there's nothing I can set down, I can't do that. And so it really is trying to kind of make sense of that. But at times that's, I think, why we get to burnout, because we just feel like we have to set our own needs aside. We can't, because we need to keep focusing on other people. So There's something that I use sometimes. It's called interpersonal effectiveness skills from dialectical behavior therapy, and it talks about the 3 different things that are important in relationships. And there's our own self-respect, there's the relationship itself, and then there is the objective of why we're talking to the person, right? And so as pastors, like it's tricky because it's built on relationships. Like we need to have relationships. We also, the objective, that is sort of the objective as well. And so trying to figure out how to, if we're always putting the relationships and the objective over our own needs, our own self, we call it like self-respect is the words they use, but almost your own needs. If you're always doing that, there's going to be times where you're going to start resenting that. You're not going to be able to always do that, and you need to kind of figure out how to take rest and recharge. And sometimes you actually have to learn that you have to disappoint people. You're going to have to maybe shift what the expectations are, not because you're failing, not because you're weak, but because you've actually been carrying a huge load, and it might not be realistic that you can carry that load always. And also our capacities change over time. Like we don't always, I know depending on the time of year, depending on how you're sleeping, depending on how other parts of your life are going, like that's going to affect your ability to carry some of those loads. So that's also key that we kind of tune into ourselves and not expect that we are always going to be operating at 100%.
Yeah, that's a really great point to the idea of capacities changing, because I think sometimes you're working within a workload expectation that you've worked within for a very long time, and then it feels like something's different. It's a really great point. You've talked a bit about stress and anxiety and depression and burnout. What is the difference between experiencing these things and having a clinical condition of them? Like if I'm experiencing anxiety in the moment versus having an anxiety disorder.
Yeah, I think it comes down in a lot of ways to, there's going to be some clinical, like the diagnostic statistic manual and all that. There's going to be some guidelines that are clinical. I don't have those memorized, but for me, when I'm working, it is often how persistent have these been? How long have they been? How is that person functioning as they're going through their daily life? I think it's also looking at, there's sometimes numbers around if it's been 2 weeks of depression or if it's been a month, then it's time to seek help. I think that can be a little bit relative depending on the person, but I think the biggest thing is if somebody's experiencing something, especially if it's new, if it's like experiencing themselves in a different way than they have before, I think it's really good to start considering whether there's somebody they can talk to, whether that a lot of people, they're not going to jump to calling a therapist first right off the bat. They might start with talking with some friends, they might start with talking with a spouse. I think there's lots of different ways that we can do that, but I think if functionality is really being impacted, and even if it's getting to the point where you're teary, I mentioned earlier, like if you're crying regularly or on the brink of tears at least, if you're experiencing some thoughts of suicide, those are things where I think those are kind of the game changers, where it's important to then maybe reach out and talk to a therapist or maybe even your doctor. Often people start with their family doctor if you have one, to be able to kind of start to make sense of what steps they might take. Some people choose medication, or they'll talk with their doctor around that before they'd ever go to therapy. Some people, it's the opposite. They want to kind of talk with a therapist first to make sense of that and see, they're nervous about the side effects and things of medication. So you kind of hear it all. And I think it's just important that people, again, if you need to talk and if there's something going on, I think it's good to start with, trying to find someone you trust that you can just put that out there and see if they can also help guide you a little bit that way too. I think for a lot of pastors, they feel pretty stuck or kind of lonely because talking to people in the church, in their congregation, like that feels risky. That feels like almost like a liability for the job.
Very fair.
Sometimes you hope that maybe there's other pastors that they can be connecting with, but sometimes it is, sometimes people carry that load kind of in silence for a while before they ask for help.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So kind of watching for shifts in really new feelings or experiences, or where functionality is starting to become impacted by what you're experiencing.
Things like sleep and diet and even just ability to concentrate and do the job and feel like still motivated and energized, like all those kind of things. Like exercise, I think, is key, not just because it's exercise, because it does actually like release the happy chemicals and the dopamine in the brain. And so there's lots of, some of that functionality is also important. And sometimes I think of it in terms of like when we're integrated and when we're disintegrated. And I think when we're integrated, we're kind of, you know, as much, everybody's going to have a different value system and things that are important that they want to have in their life. But if those are more or less being incorporated, you know, not every day, I don't think we can have a perfect balance every day, but even in any given kind of week, you're able to kind of do a few of these things that it's a blend of things that drain you and things that you kind of need to do, but also the things that recharge you and are energizing. And if all the stuff that energizes you and that you find fun there's never any time for that, I think that's another sign that maybe, you know, need to kind of readjust and recalibrate and figure out how to make some changes to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
So in the next discussion, we're going to be talking about help seeking. So we talked a bit about common mental health experiences, and now we're going to talk a bit about, you know, when do we know it's time to seek help? Yeah. So thank you.